Welcome, Rebels, to another video where we talk tactically about Star Wars Destiny. I'm your host, Gray, and today we're going to continue our discussion on the psychology of Destiny by talking about decision making that happens within the game itself. In the previous video, I covered a few topics regarding how players perceive and think about other players and their motivations. I also provided a perspective on Fantasy Flight Games' marketing tactics, rarity design, and how those aspects of the game influence or impact how we perceive Destiny as a whole. In this video, however, I want to tackle more in-game stuff since the last video dealt with all that external, out-of-game stuff. And I'm hoping that I can present to you all some thoughts on player psychology and how it relates to the choices we have to make in and even before games of Destiny. I'm going to talk about what is real, what is only perceived, and what influences our decisions. A lot of this stuff too is going to border on deck building and playstyle advice, but that's not its intention. Try to keep the topic at hand in mind at all times when watching, just as a tip. All that said, together, I hope that we will find the secrets to better play. Or the many secrets. Well, let's get on with it, shall we? Destiny is full of choices. We get to choose what characters we take with us to a game. We get to choose a battlefield. We get to choose the cards we want to put in our deck for the most part. It seems like we have a lot of choices, right? Or do we? This is the illusion of choice, and it's something that we're going to refer back to a couple of times in this video, most likely. Now, it was crucial to setting up this topic that we talked about the casual versus competitive mindset in the previous video. The competitive players, they have all the cards. They play a lot, they mess around with things, and the casuals build whatever, and they don't really care too much about winning every game. That's the base idea. And if you follow it through from a deck experimentation perspective, you end up concluding that not every printed card sees competitive play. Players at high levels of competition conclude what are the most playable cards through deck building, practice, testing, what have you. And no, there isn't some definitive list of playable cards posted somewhere on the internet. Instead, what you have is an abstract understanding that certain cards are just inherently better than others. And we've covered this topic in the past with terms like playable or strictly better. So yes, those things relate to this, but what I want to highlight for you is how limited in scope the game actually becomes when you base your view of what is good or bad on what everyone else is doing. Now, that isn't to say that those players who collectively, without knowing, are doing the game a disservice, okay? They're not doing that. In fact, it's the contrary. They're weeding the garden for you. They're telling us what's bad or plucking out what's good, or both, so you can focus your attention on a much smaller list of cards that actually makes sense to include in decks. Essentially, they're providing you with a bit of a shortcut. So what's the point of 160 card sets if only 30 of the cards are actually good? Well, that's a really great question, and I'm glad that you're on board with us if you're asking yourself that sort of question. The short answer is this: experimentation and casual play in order to lead to that weeding the garden effect. The long answer, or maybe even the long con, is future set interaction and unexplorable options, combos that don't yet exist. You could distill it down to pretty much those four answers or so, and those are kind of my favorite ones. Some people might have different ways of looking at it, but these are definitely my favorite. Now, once you've reached a point in Destiny where you've absorbed all that so-called gardening and you've made a competitive deck for play and you've gotten to the table to actually get your game on, what you have to realize is that your thoughts on the game have only just begun to take shape. Immediately, we're presented with choices, or rather, I should say options. I kind of see choices as things that are mandatory. I must choose this, or I must choose that. And options are, I can choose to choose, or I can choose to not choose. And the very first option that we're presented with is the mulligan. So I've already done a full-length video on the mulligan stuff, and you can go check out the exact and even rough math in that video. But for this video, what I want to talk about is the impact that it has on you as a player mentally. And the mulligan is the land of promises. It implicitly states that you can trade something you don't want for maybe something you do want, and you only get one shot at it. Often, I watch players in competitive play staring deeply at their opening hands, and I do this too, wondering what they don't want, what they want to pitch back, and also thinking about what they could get if they gave up 3 cards or 4 card. Well, I'm here to say that you shouldn't pressure that player, and don't feel pressured by people that want you to hurry along with your mulligan. This is a very critical game time decision that many don't take as seriously as they ought to. Now, naturally, I cannot in this video tell you exactly what you want to keep and what not to. That becomes a deck building topic for another day, or maybe even for another content creator to cover, or you can join those content creators that do coaching and stuff like that to go over that kind of stuff. I don't provide that service. But what we can talk about here is the critical element of the mulligan to set the pace for the game. And setting the proper pace in your game brings an element of optimism with it. And with that, you might even say better and more alert plays, possibly anyway. But one could conjecture, and this is probably the most theoretical thing I'm going to talk about in this video, one could conjecture that getting the cards that you want does put you in a better mood and thus helps you make better decisions. But going back to the facts, this isn't just feeling good about your game. And the mulligan is an important option to understand about Destiny, as it is intrinsically tied to the knowledge of your deck. The cards that are, and that means the cards that are 1-ofs, the cards that are 2-ofs, its win condition, the sequence of events you want to have play out, and things like that. Now, some of that is literally just memorization, right? And that's all psychological. And that's why people are always talking about you should stay hydrated during tournaments and stuff like that. Have a good amount of caffeine, make sure you eat something and all that stuff. Because you want to be alert and you want to be able to utilize, your entire brain or as much of it as possible while you're playing this game. And I would behoove every player who is on the cusp of considering or becoming a competitive player right now, understand the mulligan and its purpose in this game. Understand the math, understand its importance, understand your deck, utilize your memorization, know the ins and outs of the meta, things like that. It is one of the many decisions that you're going to make in every single game of Destiny, right? And it's critical to the overall strategy of your deck and also the game that you want to play. And in Destiny, you always want to play the game that you want to play, not the game that your opponent wants you to play. All right. Once you've achieved liftoff after completing your mulligan, we all know that it's time for the roll-off, and maybe this section will be a little controversial for some people, but nobody genuinely considers the roll-off a major component to Destiny. But when the 5 dice starts were coming about with the release of Empire at War, it was a major talking point for some time. But ultimately, it's not a deciding factor in how we build our decks. And if there's a 5 dice start that's good, people will experiment with it and discover whether or not it's good or bad. And if it's bad, it will fall by the wayside and never be spoken of again. Now, what actually is a major decision is the choice of battlefield. And just as with mulligans, I did do a video on that about choosing the battlefield that you bring to the game. But there are also a lot more battlefields available now since that video was published. But I don't want to duplicate the work from that video where I talk about how one might go about choosing a battlefield with a consideration for basic player psychology. Instead, what I want to talk about is the effect of choosing between the 2 battlefields brought to the game. Now, unlike the mulligan and the roll-off, which have built-in statistical probabilities, the impact of the chosen battlefield is actually very, very concrete. You either go first or you take 2 shields on your character, right? And here we go again with choices. You have to choose one or the other. And to a lot of players, going first is the way to be. Perhaps it's even an inherent element of your deck. For example, I play Ray Maz Ezra and I play Han Snap, and those decks are out there. I'm not the originator of those decks by any means. And both those decks really want to go first every round because it's part of its win condition to disrupt and steal resources with Ezra or Snap on the very first action of the turn. Now, players are going to see, and they have seen for a long, long time, that going first is a very strong option, even if their deck doesn't support it directly. They have this thing, and yes, going first does have its advantages. For a lot of people, I think it removes the paranoia of having to protect your resources, right? Like maintaining access to all 5 cards in your hand. You get to look at the game state as this pure thing. It's very comforting to know that you're going to be the first one to affect it before your opponent goes and messes up the entire game for you, right? So as such, there's this, inherent fear in going second, feeling like you might be at some kind of disadvantage. And against some decks, that's absolutely justified, right? Like going up against those decks that I just mentioned, because action cheating does exist in this game. And if you're one of those players who has that fear, I would like you to listen to the next part of this section very, very, very closely. Choosing shields and thus going second is, in my opinion, and in many cases, the best option. In a meta that is dominated by aggro decks, as this game is and has been since day one, taking shields provides a 2 health boon to your team, again, in many, many cases, right? We can look at Palpatine as having 17 health out of the gate, right? We can think of Night Sister as being able to ping herself 2 more times, right? We can think of General Riken being usable on the first round without any sort of setup, right? Shields have a lot of advantages other than just health now, and with the new rules reference guide, they stick around longer. They're a utility piece in some decks, and when considering to take shields or not, you have to think about your deck's win con and the archetype that you're playing against as well. Now, against most aggro decks, especially anything with high die sides or with explosive characters like Sabine, for example, you want shields. And in some cases, that may be the only real mitigation that you actually get. Now, consider also that 2 shields are at least a single action and resource to generate, right? If we think of defensive stance as the gold standard when considering shield generation, that costs 1. It gives me 2 shields only to 1 target. Opening shields can be divided among your characters or stacked. It's your choice, right? If this is something that you hadn't considered until now, I want you to take a look at my battlefield choice video, then rewatch this section again to gain a bit more of a completer understanding of the advantages to taking shields. Also, talk to the good players at your FLGS because they're going to know what I'm talking about here. So that fear that you have about going second is something that is very inherent to all people. We don't want to go second, we want to go first. It's a natural thing. But Destiny places this decision before you as if there's really a choice to be made. And what you've got to do psychologically is let go of the natural tendency to think that it's just bad and nothing else, and accept the possibility that there actually is another choice, and try it out. I had this feeling like you're going to feel better about it in the long run. And if what I'm saying doesn't convince you and you just want a single justification, a too long didn't read for why taking shields is generally the best option, well, all the best players out there think it is, upwards of 90% of the time. Are you happy with that answer? I hope so. Destiny is a game of psychological warfare. The back and forth nature of rounds and its turns puts you in a constant battle of cat and mouse for 15 plus minutes. And each and every decision made on a turn has you weighing your best option. And to begin, there's only so many options to choose from, right? You can activate a character or support, play a card from your hand, use an activated ability, resolve dice, discard to reroll, and of course you can claim the battlefield. And as the round progresses, we execute actions in a certain sequence, hoping that our decision making ultimately gives us the advantage to win. And we are basing those actions that we take on the cards in our hand, the board state, those cards possibly in our opponent's hand, maybe our deck size, the damage on our characters, etc. Right? There is a lot to consider, but there are a few critical points worth highlighting that occur within all rounds of Destiny, and they all relate to a concept that I like to refer to generally as tension. And there are different varieties of tension, and the first one that I want to go over is dice tension. Dice tension comes about in a game when either us or our opponent are showing die faces that are favorable to us or them, right? So lethal damage is a point of tension in Destiny, for example, right? We know that if we don't do something about that, that damage is going to happen. It's going to kill one of our characters. And we want to deal with dice tension from the moment that we come across it, right? And the tension is just something that we want to dispel. And as such, every competitive player and deck runs a healthy amount of die removal cards, right? And we do that because it helps cut the tension. It creates less unfavorable situations for us, right? We can't really say it's more favorable for us, but we can definitely say it's less unfavorable. And if we think back for a moment to the first section on the illusion of choice of deck construction, this is one of those things that we literally could have an entire discussion on for hours, because just as dice are inherent to the game of Destiny, so too are ways to manage them, right? And that's the key to breaking dice tension, is just management. You can't do much else about it. You can't literally remove every single die in most cases. So you gotta include ways to manage them in your deck. And not only is the card pool, so not only from the original first section is the card pool smaller than we think based on all that experimentation and garden weeding, so too are our decks smaller than we think, because there is a requirement that we include ways to break dice tension at regular intervals throughout the game. That could be once per round, twice per round in some cases. So decks essentially become 22 to 24 cards, in my opinion. Feel free to argue with me in the comments about that if you really like to. Some people might not want to see dice tension as anything worth discussing. But when your opponent is showing some dice that you don't want to see, you manage it immediately so that you can get on with the rest of your turn. Where things get really interesting are scenarios where perhaps you have, let's say, 2 cards in your hand, right? One is an electroshock, and Jabba just rolled a 2 discard side, and you really want to protect that other card, right? So the choice is you're either going to lose both cards if you don't manage this particular situation, or you use the electroshock to get rid of the discard to preserve that one card that you wanted, right? But then you've also created this 1 discard scenario for yourself, right? Similarly, there's a scenario where you have no resources, but you do have a die showing a resource and another die showing a damage for a resource cost. And what's sitting across from you? A disrupt side on your opponent's die. That sucks, right? Well, that's Destiny. And those are the kind of choices that tension creates within games, and you must be able to respond to them or you're going to lose ground. Beyond dice tension, we have something called card tension. And this one's a little easier to understand, as anyone who has played any sort of card game knows that at all times there is information that is hidden from you. And that can be defined as cards in your opponent's deck and cards in your opponent's hand. Remember too that the cards in your hand and deck act in very much the same way for your opponent. To them, that's the hidden knowledge. Now, in a standard game of playing cards, we have complete knowledge of the deck. We just don't know the order that the cards are going to be drawn. And we know, for example, that there's 4 of every number or face card, there's 2 in each color, and overall there's 52 cards in the deck. Now, Destiny doesn't follow those rules, and so metagame knowledge actually becomes king. Now, that said, there's still bluffing that is involved in this game because it is a card game, and it takes a skilled player to utilize it properly and also to not be fooled by it as well. The way that we can best combat being fooled is just to know all the cards and to continually ask yourself, based on the board state and what you know about the metagame, what is the best possible outcome for my opponent? Or what is the worst possible outcome for me that could happen right now? And that is how your opponent thinks, because it's how you ought to think. Remember that this is all psychological. And to gain the advantage, you have to know how your opponent thinks. And you need look no further than your own thoughts in the matter to understand that in Destiny. So then, how does one use card tension to their advantage? Well, the age-old way of doing that in a card game is the bluff, right? But the bluff actually has a variable impact in this game compared to poker for the above-mentioned reasons about knowledge of the deck. If you're playing against someone who has absolutely zero metagame knowledge, you're probably not going to bluff them. You might just surprise them straight up because they have no idea what you're playing. But basically, let's go through a scenario. Even if I know you have a dodge in your hand, right? 2 costs, remove all dice showing range damage. I'm still going to try and fix my dice to their maximum because I want you to spend that damn dodge. Hence, Destiny works sort of in the opposite of the bluff, right? And a lot of good players actually use something called the bait. So instead of the bluff, we're using the bait. And there are ways to combat something like it's a way to combat something like mass removal, and it's not that, it's not to try and go hard. Basically, you don't want to go hard on dice fixing. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. To combat this, instead, you can just resolve 2 dice of damage and then re-roll the others, right? Resolve 1 or 2 dice again, re-roll the others, resolve 1 or 2 dice again. In order to what you're doing then is making the investment terrible for them to play that dodge or block or mass removal in a very psychological way. The trade-off is slowing down your turn, of course, But in the event that your opponent is on a pass route of play, then you've already called their bluff, and you're simply baiting them to lose value on their card or their cards. Similarly, you can play against or around cards like defensive position in the same manner, but since it's only a one-cost removal, there's a bit less tension there because they have more access to it, right? Again, just think about this. Would you want to spend two resources to remove just 2 dice, right? In the case of dodge or block, very specific dice, right? And the answer is probably not. So you know that you can win that little mental battle by simply being a nuisance to your opponent. Apologize if that last section got a little off the rails there. I was trying to illustrate the point a bit differently than I had written it in my script. But anyway, to get back on track, something that I discussed in the Battlefield video that I had mentioned earlier was claim tension. And I wanted to revisit it here because of how stressful claim tension can actually be. Now, when we consider just how badly many of us want to go first and how that influences our decision to use our battlefield or take shields, understanding that claim tension is a thing is really not that far off. In fact, it's right around the corner. Now, claiming is the final decision that one of 2 players, assuming you're playing a 2-player game, at the table is going to make. Now, 2 equally paced decks will find themselves in a claim war more often than 2 decks of varying speed, right? Claim tension comes about when every action that you want to take is becoming weighed against the option to just claim and let your opponent do whatever they want. And in the past, I've talked about cards that caused claim tension, like Planetary Uprising. Also, battlefields like Command Center can cause so much claim tension before the game has even started that players shy away from it the vast majority of the time, even before considering the speed of the deck that they're playing against. That's how much tension it causes, to the point of blindness, right? Now, for most games, however, you're not going to see Planetary Uprising and Command Center. They're actually not as super popular as they were in the previous meta, though Command Center is still around. Instead, you'll be weighing your options to claim against getting that extra point of damage, or resolving an extra resource side, or maybe re-rolling to increase the utility of your dice. And there is another very personal, very psychological element that we bring to the concept of claim tension. And it isn't caused by anything directly involved with the game. It's really ourselves. And it's essentially this. A lot of people feel that leaving dice on the table unresolved feels bad. And deep down inside, we want to see something resolved on all our dice in a given round, right? Because in a lot of cases, we've either paid character points to put that die in our deck, or we paid some resource to put it on the table. And what happens is we become blind to the risk versus reward of claiming versus trying to get an extra dollar or 2 out of our dice, or an extra damage or something like that. You know, and the thing is, even more so than the beginning of the game, mid-game, going first is even more impactful. And if you've played a lot of Destiny, you already know that's a fact. So don't let yourself be fooled into taking that extra resource first claiming the battlefield if you really don't know exactly why you need it. You need to be able to justify your decision psychologically rather than just jump into this thing where you say, I need to get value out of all my dice, period. The lesson here is don't be your own worst enemy. So what this and the previous discussions is leading up to is something called turn sequencing, and it's a concept that very few players properly understand. And the only time you actually hear it referred to offhandedly is when someone calls something a misplay. And what they're saying is someone either did something completely out of proper sequence, like rolling in the rookie pilot before rolling in your vehicle, or they failed to consider a critical piece of their opponent's game plan in some way. So much so that maybe it even backfired on them, and even though they may have had an actual way to deal with it. Now, turn sequencing comes directly into conflict with all the forms of tension that I mentioned. Turn sequencing wants you to think many, many turns ahead to see what's going to happen on both sides and adjust that when your expectations aren't met or the board state changes. It's a very complex concept, and it's how the best players think, and it's why they can consistently win games against other great players or against players who are even much worse players, even if they're playing a way better deck and they're playing, and the good player is playing a really, really bad deck, right? They know and understand what their best order for things is. And they also understand that that's going to be interrupted along the way with having to deal with stuff that comes up during the game, like a card being played against you, a die being removed, etc. They're like little stop signs, literally along the way, essentially, right? And the way to improve your turn sequencing is literally just to play a lot of Destiny with the same deck, and also to play against some of the best decks, piloted by ideally a few different people in a gauntlet or of some kind. And you're going to hear a lot about that stuff once the regional season really gets into full swing. And you heard a lot about it during Store Championship season, right? You want to learn how to most effectively deal with the tension that other cards and dice create in your game while staying on course for your win condition. And keep at it with that deck that you really like until you know it like the back of your hand, right? Only then will you be strong enough with your deck to see if you're going to make the cut in that big tournament. So a couple of sections ago, I talked about ways to break card tension related to mass removal. And by that, I mean anything that removes 2 or more dice. But that little explanation didn't convince me to actually exclude this section from the video, so I supplemented it back in. And in fact, talking about that only strengthened my resolve to shoot this, because I feel like I have a lot to say on this, both in relation to this video's topic and also based on personal experience. So some of this is going to be at odds with what I just said in the section on claim tension, but hear me out, because I think it's important that you do hear it, especially if you're a new or up-and-coming competitive player. And here's my one big piece of advice, okay? Stop trying to fix all your dice in the pool at once if you know your opponent is holding on to mass removal or trying to bait you into it, okay? And this is not hard to determine, okay? Remember the pass thing that I mentioned earlier? Yeah, well, that's part of it. There's only a few reasons that your opponent is going to pass consecutively in this game, and the vast majority of the time, it's to bait you into rolling something that they want to remove specifically. The other time, it's to bait you into claiming so they can use something like Never Tell Me the Odds, or they want to set up their board state with a bunch of supports or upgrades for next round, which become more important than actually claiming at that very moment, right? Remember that the bluff is hard in this game, but seeing the bait is not. And I get why you want to fix every single die in your pool all at once. It makes the most action economical sense, right? Roll everything out, let's get it all into the size you want, resolve it all in one action. You want to take the least amount of actions in order to claim so you can go first next round. That's totally understandable. But in the face of potential mass removal, which, let me tell you right now, is coming back, and there is quite a bit of it in this game, and every set it seems like you get another card or two. If you're doing that mass die fixing, you're going down a really terrible path, all right? And I don't want to follow you. Players most often actually refer to this particular aspect of dice fixing as getting greedy. I hear that at my store all the time. And when it happens and you see it, it disappoints the heck out of you. My favorite play in the whole world is passing, watching someone discard to reroll their entire hand against my mill deck. And when they finally have all that lethal damage showing, they think, oh man, I'm going to kill Padme or something like that. I play Hyperspace Jump. And just how mad that person gets, is not my fault. It was brought upon them by no one other than themselves and their failure to see that they were actually being baited into that play the entire time. And I bring this up because action economy and turn sequencing shouldn't be the only consideration you make in sequencing the very end of your turn. Don't let yourself be guided down a path thinking that it ought to be what you ultimately strive for, which is that ultimate action economy. Just like thinking that you should go first at the start of the game puts you onto a narrow path of thinking, so does mass dice fixing and action economy. You got to be more mindful than that. Don't succumb to your inner dark side. All right, Rebels, I covered a lot in this video, and I hope that it all made at least some sense to you. Trying to analyze and pick apart every element of this game's design and how it influences our thinking is not an easy task, and I realized this as I was writing and constantly rewriting the script for this video. I had to think a lot about how some of my ranting related back to the topic at hand, and I had to cut out a lot and reword a lot of stuff. And I certainly hope that at the very least I made it digestible for the layman Destiny player. And as I said to start this series, I'm not sure how many more installments there will be, but as of right now, there's none planned. But I think it's totally worth revisiting the topic as the game evolves. And I had a ton of fun making this video because it appeals to me personally. It's sort of a look into my mind about what I consider every step of the way in Destiny to be, and what I know every other player does too intrinsically. But what I really want to know is if you guys like it. Did you hate it? Let me know either way. And if there's a different topic that you guys would like to see me cover, I'm open to hearing about it. I think the next few weeks is going to be littered with spoilers and stuff like that. And while that's all well and good, I think there's a much deeper game to be played in Destiny that goes beyond the dice and the cards. And that's the game that ultimately I want to talk about. So yeah, talk to me in the comments or on Facebook or on Twitter. I'm all ears, guys. And I hope you enjoyed this one. And while I prepare for the next one, which will be on who knows what, keep playing Destiny, take heed to what you have learned, and may the Force be with you.